Hell xenophobic, racist. What if I told you that there's a member of Congress teaching illegal immigrants how to skirt the law, and somehow she's still doing it? It was an April afternoon in a small Texas border town, hot and restless, a corner of a world that used to be measured by the whir of a coffee grinder freshly removing the secrets from the air, by unhurried mornings, by neighbors who always knew the other's business, whether they wanted to or not. But now the easygoing beat had disintegrated, a wave of new faces had washed through the community, and whispers of something sinister had begun to hiss from porch to porch. From behind the window of the old general store on Main Street, the elderly proprietor squinted through dust at yet another collection of newcomers, a group that, nervous and twitchy, turned on its heel and trudged away. He bowed over the counter toward an out-of-town young reporter and grumbled through a wry laugh. I never thought I'd say this, but recently I've begun to feel like an outsider in my hometown, and I'm not the one who moved. He glanced around briefly and then gestured to the street. His eyes squint behind thick rimmed glasses. Everybody suddenly showing up out of nowhere, speaking from the dark, looking over their shoulders. Towns change practically overnight, makes a man begin to wonder what in the hell is going on, really. The reporter scribbled notes, brow raised in interest, animate in his throng. The old man leaned forward and spoke in a conspiratorial tone. I'm no pot stirrer. Since that politician, what's her name, Omar started telling folk it's okay to go around the law, teaching him how to get away with ICE. Things here got real complicated, real fast, but what is her angle? Votes money. Something worse. Enter the group of robbers, exchanging fast whispers, glancing from outside, and he looks anxiously out the window. You gotta wonder, don't ya? What's her end game exactly? Who does this truly benefit? He looked at the reporter, watching their face go from curious to genuinely intrigued. Answer me this, son, since when do we use the law to freaking protect people who break the law? Makes about as much sense as trying to extinguish a fire with gasoline. The old man lifted himself up, shaking his head, slowly. No more mirth as he expressed genuine concern. He looked again at the crowd, now gathering, outside detention, if such a thing were possible, thick, overwhelming, needing space to breathe. I'm telling you, he sighed, with tired eyes gazing out the window. This town will not sleep again until someone up there in Washington decides which side he should be on. As night descended, there, in the little zip-up and zip-town border town, one thing was certain, something big was coming. Something that would force America to finally come to terms with where its allegiances truly lay down at the police station. Clearly this chief had lost patience, and frankly, who could blame him? Glancing at the mass of reporters with microphones shoved up to his mouth, the tough, weary, no-nonsense cop spoke in a weary frustration of the sort you might expect a guy who spent his days trying to enforce laws that politicians were determined to break. You know what it's like. His infamous evil eye began scanning the small crowd, as if daring anyone to break his concentration. It's like we're out here building fences, and then people like Omar come traipsing along behind us with wire cutters saying, here's a map for you guys, here's how you jump over. The audience laughed, nervously, not knowing whether they were funny or gross. That, however, did not put a smile on the face of the sheriff. With every one of my officers, every time they make an arrest, and through the human smuggling process, they are running up against some pamphlet or some recording of that congresswoman. You got Omar explaining how to evade ICE detection. Can you believe it? Part of Center for a New American Security / member of United States Congress helping criminals evade law enforcement. You might as well have Bonnie and Clyde advising people on how to rob banks. At least they didn't pretend it was public service. The reporter scribbled furiously, sensing a front page. The sheriff leaned towards the podium, gripping it, voice shaking. Now you without you edge laced with exasperation and anger. My job, and that of my team, is to protect American citizens, actual people, who pay taxes and walk on street corners, who obey laws. But nowadays it feels more like we're running around cleaning up messes someone like Omar made to win some twisted popularity contest. It's exhausting. It's negligent, and frankly it's an affront to every officer who puts on the badge. Every morning he waited, teeth gritting, visibly picking his vocabulary before finally signing off. Maybe it's high time. Someone up in Washington read the room and realized that if you spend your day defending lawbreakers, you are part of the problem, not the solution. The silence afterward was weighing. Tense, almost electric. Before the microphones, as the sheriff walked away, the reporters exchanged glances and hovered with nervous fingers over their phones, poised to hit send on the story whose headlines would fire up yet another political wildfire. And as they danced like so many moths around the flaming electric light, one question hung unvoiced in the leaden Texas air. How much longer can America's guardians hold the line when their own leaders seem determined to undermine it from the inside? In Washington, however, politicians like Congresswoman Omar claim they have clean hands. And it felt like there just were questions galore, to which cable news didn't seem interested in hearing the answers. That is exactly why Representative Brandon Gill stood in front of a packed local community hall in his home district. Tonight Texas is ready to listen. On the night of a bingo game or a town meeting about potholes, normally, the little town auditorium was a sleepy place. But the mood was an entirely different thing. Rose metal seats filled quickly with restless residents making eye contact tighter than barbed wire. Their patience scattered to the density of gas station coffee in the crowd somewhere. A voice muttered loudly enough for those nearby to silently bob their heads up and down in affirmation. Gillfather better have some goddamn answers for us tonight. G.I. squatted several paces from the line until he adjusted his sleeves and pumped his body with pulse and stretched forward for action. A middle-aged man stepped up to the microphone. His tone was both calmer and, clearly enough, fed up. Look, Congressman. It's not personal against Omar, but she certainly made it personal against us. We're fighting every single day against people who have been emboldened by her reckless promises, he continued. Our resources are limited, our taxes raised, and she's out there teaching people how to avoid ICE. And tell me this, how is that not betrayal? Gill nodded slowly, and remained silent, leaving the allegation suspended in the air. A woman near the front piped in a harsh tone, the bitterness in her words palpable. Omar is putting politics before our safety. My sister, just last week, found some gathered inside her shed, holding flyers. Omar herself was out there handing out advice on how to evade immigration authorities. It is how is that legal even? Congressman Gill. At this, the audience erupted in a nervous flare of agreement. Gill understood that tonight, these citizens desired more than political politisms. They demanded accountability. The murmurs quieted some when an older man slowly hoisted himself out of a chair at the front and took the microphone in both hands, clutching it like he was leaning into a gusty Texas wind. He cleared his throat during a long and dramatic pause that arrested attention like that of any professional orator. Look here, folks. He began to talk quietly but emphatically. Now, I'm not somebody who wants to make all the fights, but Representative Omar seems to have declared war on us already. She's breaking our laws, she's handing out instructions on how to avoid ICE, and we're the ones who have to deal with it. He looked at the faces around him. Some nodding furiously. Living by the whim and waiting with bated breath. Hell, my grandson went through the pamphlet with me. She hands out. My own kin. The boy had believed it was a kind of prank. I mean, no joke, is this some sick joke Washington's playing on us? Bitter laughter coursed through the audience, then angry murmurs. But as the old man turned to sit, an older woman leapt up, her eyes aflame, fists clenched at her sides. Omar is being empathetic, she said, clearly having rehearsed the counterargument in her mind. Defiantly, her voice sharp, she argued, the words bouncing off the hall's aging wood paneling. Why can't we understand? These people just need help. Compassion, a different voice replied, low and gruff. How is it compassionate to place us in danger in our own homes? The room erupted again in chaos. Words sped across the aisles, accusations left in midair, tangling. Politics wouldn't be allowed to occupy all of life anymore. It had become personal, a visceral clash between two incarnations of America. Congressman Brandon Gill waited briefly, allowing the candlelight around the room to settle into a steady glow before raising a hand solemnly. He knew that timing was everything, and as the voices turned to a low murmur, he leaned into the microphone and chose his words carefully and deliberately, unapologetically. "Okay, guys," he began coolly, but the quiet fury of a man fed up with games was palpable. "It's time to remember the real job of an elected official. Not SEAL Team 6, and not fundraising, and not flaunting the law. It's about saving yourself, your family, your community." He paused as his eyes flickered down. "And I regret to say that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar has forgotten, or possibly never learned, a very basic truth." Gil stepped one slow step forward, leaning in on his next words like he was announcing a verdict in a courtroom. "Drama. Let's be real here, okay? If Omar really cared about American citizens, she wouldn't spend her days making people run around about our laws. The reality is obvious. She is not serving America's best interests. Perhaps, just perhaps, it's time she returned to the real place her loyalties seemed to be, Somalia." And the silence that ensued was not shock. It was deep thought, and then, all of a sudden, impromptu clapping. More united, and louder than even Gil anticipated. The gray-haired man in the front row stood once more, his voice drowning out all the cheers. "I say enough's enough. Omar's gotta go." A voice joined him, then another, then a chorus. And citizens standing to attention, shouting together, fists held aloft defiantly. "Send her back, send her back." In hours, the grassroots outrage from a remote corner of Texas hit the news, provoked debate nationally, and ultimately, of course, reverberated down the marble halls of Congress itself. Which Washington has always loved, of course, a colorful circus, especially one it does not have to pay for. And nothing conditioned the Beltway media more pent up than the whiff of controversy rising from the heartland. That we Texas towns' grassroots anger bubbled to the surface like spilled oil on hot asphalt, shaking the steps of Congress with another petition to deport Ilhan Omar. Sure enough, the Capitol Hill crowd is never going to turn down a good showdown. They turned it into primetime entertainment, somehow. And now there they all were, crammed at least as tightly as lobbyists at a cocktail fundraiser, reporters madly jotting notes, cameramen elbowing each other for position in the main hearing chamber. The vibe was somewhere between a heavyweight championship fight and the nervous silence before a courtroom verdict. Glowing shafts of late afternoon light came through the high windows, hints of dust hung furtively in the air above rows of wrought wooden benches filled with reporters, staffers, and more polite gawkers than you'd see at the launch of a scandalous political memoir. The sound of the camera lens's focus adjustment knurled softly, moaning to life and locking into two people at either end of the room. Congressman Brandon Gill was seated coolly at his table, shoulders squared, looking like the kid who'd done all his homework and was just waiting to make everybody else look dumb. His gaze wandered now and then to his notes, unflinching, confident. If he felt nervous, he wasn't showing it. Across the aisle, Representative Ilhan Omar shuffled in her chair, meticulously controlled but unable to hide the smoldering resentment lighting behind her carefully neutral visage. Her fingers nervously tapped out a slow tattoo on the polished mahogany desk in front of her. Steady, measured, but subtly defiant. The sidelong glances she threw at Gil held enough frozen disdain to make even the most brazen of men flinch. In Omar's mind, Gil wasn't just wrong, he had gone too far, had crossed an invisible line she thought was uncrossable. The gallery crowd was standing room only. Interns squatted uncomfortably on the steps of the stairwell, loosened neckties, and frenziedly held notebooks. Veteran journalists, who'd covered scandals aplenty to fill an encyclopedia, gaped hungrily. If they're hovering over their pen, searching for that perfect bit of biting quote or slip of the tongue. Cameras hum. Lenses trained intently on the faces of the representatives, prepared to record close-ups of every twitch, every glare, every sign of who might blink first. The enormous, marble colonnades of the chamber rose above, impassive witnesses to it all, the austerity of their dignity a foil to the caveat emptor drama unfolding below. All right, then, and then like it was in a ceremony, the gavel went up. A hush went through the room instantly. Eyes snapped. Hold your breath, here we go. And as the silence fell, it sunk in for everyone involved. This pipe dream was no longer just about deportation petitions or partisan squabbling. It was a historic clash that would pose questions to the country it had chosen, for so long, to avoid. This was not a standard congressional hearing today. It seemed like a struggle for the soul of America, and there wasn't a single person in that room who was about to look away. The chairman gavelled again, the echoes subsided, and the Congressman Brandon Gill leaned forward into the microphone, fixing his gaze on Ilhan Omar. He spoke with a cool voice, but one that rippled. A clarity that allowed no room for misinterpretation. Well, let's get one thing straight. Gill read out each word with measured precision. I never called for Ilhan Omar's deportation, as some in this room might imply. But yes, I absolutely believe America would be better off if she was deported. A wave of gasped whispers passed through the crowd. The pens of reporters swirled furiously, eager to capture every trenchant syllable. Gill didn't hesitate. He let the statement hang in the air like the thread of a buzzsaw, not ready to sting just yet but all the more capable for it, leaned forward a little bit. There doesn't appear to have been a quiet voice present in the room. Gill continued deliberately. We've had 4 years of an open border. The Israelites fleeing from Egypt had a chaotic, uncontrolled 4 years just outside the door. And how is Congresswoman Omar responding? The way she dispenses advice on how to evade ICE is as matter-of-fact as how a mall Santa hands out candy canes. And, yes, I apologize if that hurts some people's feelings, but really, a sitting U.S. representative publicly advising millions of illegal immigrants on how to evade law enforcement is not only bad advice. It's utterly un-American. And Gill's words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The room was vibrating with a sort of vigilante agitation. Then Ilhan Omar straightened her spine, leaned into her own microphone, and answered back word for word with deliberate anger. You are Congressman Gill, she said mildly, her voice steady and even, and precise enough to cleave steel. You're stoking nothing but hate and division. Your smear of unfounded allegations plays to your racist, xenophobic base. Just fiction, no facts. She stopped, eyebrows cocked defiantly. If you do have actual evidence, and not conspiracy theories invented to fill your campaign mailers, now would be the time for you to show it. Gill didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head a little to the side. A wry smile, quietly, dryly, just a little condescending. Ah, yes. The classic Omar maneuver, Gill replied dryly, injecting a note of mockery. If anyone disagrees with you, they are racist. Right? That's your protection from accountability, right, Congresswoman? He sat up for a moment, looking at the reporters who were hungrily writing down, hoping to capture every word. You call me a panderer, he went on, but remind me, who's collecting the donations off this controversy? Who benefits from labeling half the country xenophobic? He allowed the rhetorical questions to hang, and as soon as Omar opened her mouth to answer, Gill rushed on, fast. His voice cooler now, as surgical as a scalpel. This is not about race or xenophobia or whatever other red herring you choose to wave in front of us today. This isn't a talent thing, it's a loyalty thing. The only division being sown here is by someone who swore an oath to uphold American law, then turned around and issued playbooks for breaking it. A few scattered claps quickly followed, shushed by Capitol security, but the symbolic victory lingered in the tension-filled air. Omar's face tightened with unapologetic rage. Her voice wavering a bit, enough to indicate that she had been shaken. How dare you question my loyalty? Omar snapped, her facade cracking for the first time. The aim of your rhetoric is to stoke the fears and hatreds of your extremist followers. Gill arched one eyebrow and reclined back nonchalantly. Fear and prejudice, he said, drugs in low gear, as if chewing them over. No, Congresswoman, this is not fear, it is anger. And frankly, it's justified. The American people have a right to ask questions when someone they elected to represent their interests in no small part serves the interests of people who have no business here in the first place. He glanced this way and that in the silent chamber, then zeroed back in on Omar. So yes, let me reiterate. I'm not going to personally send you packing to take the next plane out, Ilhan. But please believe me when I write that millions of Americans feel that it's time you went back to Somalia, where your heart and priorities obviously lie." Silence fell like an anvil. The reporters collectively gasped. Pencils frozen. Mid-stroke. The debate had taken a never-before-seen turn, and with it a queasy question loomed: had Gill overstepped his bounds, or had he merely said what others were fearing to say? Brandon Gill opened his briefcase, calmly took out a small audio recorder and placed it on the polished congressional table, as if he were a political archaeologist in some dig with a rare artifact, leaning slightly into the microphone. He gave Congresswoman Omar a half-pitying glance and spoke. "Congresswoman Omar, since you have stood on the floor of the House each of the last 3 weeks and insisted that the claims made against you are simply figments of imaginations of bigoted minds, let me submit Exhibit A." He smirked. "I apologize if this contradicts your victimhood narrative." Gill pressed play, and an unmistakable voice, cool, collected, and unmistakably Omar's, rang crisply from out of the congressional chamber. "Remember that ICE agents cannot enter without a warrant. You don't have to open your door. You are not required to answer questions about your immigration status. Remain silent. Close your curtains. Stay indoors. They can't touch you." It reverberated in the chamber loud and clear, a surreal soundtrack that had journalists writing as if their Pulitzer depended on it. Omar's anger turned to something resembling desperation. Her perfectly manicured calm started to fray at the edges. There was a slight stammer in her answer. She was apparently so unused to having her words used against her. And then, in a feat of rhetorical gymnastics, she somehow said, "It's clear that this audio has been taken out of context. I was simply informing residents of their constitutional rights." "Ah, constitutional rights," Gill interjected with dry irony, eyebrows raised in mock admiration. "How generous of you, Congresswoman, to provide civics lessons to criminal trespassers. What's next? Are you going to suggest we start giving Miranda warnings at the border, with a complimentary map to the nearest sanctuary city?" Downcast looks in the chamber were met with ripples of chuckles, mostly muted but just loud enough to hurt. Omar fumed, visibly annoyed and not accustomed to being mocked in a public setting, seeming unable to get her balance. "Mock away, Mr. Gill," she retorted feebly, her voice quavering. "You are twisting my words for your political theater." Gill cocked his head to one side, his eyes shining with ironic sympathy. "My dear colleague, the circus was well established long before I arrived. You donate free passes year after year. I'm just illuminating something." He paused to take a meaningful look around the room, before addressing Omar. "Now would you mind explaining to all of us how telling illegal immigrants to ignore law enforcement is anything other than intentional subversion of the laws of our land?" With an unmistakable "the dog who caught the car" tilt of his jowly head, he allowed Omar to be laid bare under the bright glare of camera lights and penetrating stares from across the room. For someone so skilled at wielding the victim card, Omar now had checkmate, and every eye in the chamber awaited her next move. Sadly, Omar's cool didn't just fade away. It wandered so far off the tracks, it wrecked the train right in a political black hole. Live, in front of America. Burning, she spoke loudly and clearly into the microphone, forgetting the first rule of politics: when your opponent has you on the ropes, curse words are rarely your wingman. "This is absolute bullshit. Xenophobic racists," Omar shot back, the words snapping across the chamber to shockingly crystalline effect. It was like someone had triggered a fire alarm. Every head jerked up, eyes going wide. Even the gallery watchdogs who've seen political theatrics exchanged gaping glances. For a brief moment, dead silence hung in the air. The fevered note-taking of dozens of reporters scrambling to transform the Congresswoman's words into tomorrow's headlines followed. Somewhere, no doubt, a late-night comic was jotting notes for his next monologue and silently thanking Omar for doing his job for him. Gill, meanwhile, regarded her with a quiet smile. One brow raised, bemused, as if this was a poke at a challenger who'd asked for the fight and then kicked herself. When he did talk, there was that calm, surgical precision in his voice indicating a total faith in the rightness of his viewpoint. "Representative Omar, Your language tonight just stands as a testament to the dignity that you have brought to your office, Gil laughed, his sarcasm as finely meshed as Texas barbecue. But before we start placing you with shorter sentences and a more colorful vocabulary, we have to address a much bigger issue. Your betrayal. Omar's jaw tightened, her hands gripping the microphone so hard it seemed to teeter on the verge of breaking under her fingers before she could even get out a response. Gil continued without a hitch, voice even. Deliberate. Relentless. Because you didn't just violate your oath to support and defend the Constitution, you tore it up and tossed the pieces. Like confetti. These American nationals trusted you. And you handed that faith to people who openly defy our laws. He gave a dramatic pause, eyes unflinching. How does your behavior in any part help the single mother whose tax dollars pay your salary? Or the dad putting in 3 shifts just so his kids can walk safely to school? Gil let his rhetorical questions hang over Omar like cold rain, compelling her, and everyone watching, to confront reality. You instantly make a toxic and hateful thing out of anyone's displeasure with you, he added, his voice hardening to iron. But name-calling doesn't constitute evidence. You didn't merely cross the line. You stepped all over it, parading a parade, and now you're baffled that anyone noticed. Then slightly leaned forward and dropped his voice to a near whisper, with more power than you could have ever hoped for with a shout. You took an oath to defend America. And yet you swear fealty to an entirely different set of interests. So yes. Let's stop pretending. Maybe you weren't meant to be here, Congresswoman Omar, maybe you were meant to be back in Somalia. There is far better to be found in Congress, and frankly, in America. A second ripple of murmurs erupted, swelling into a few claps. Then an explosion, the kind you find on Independence Day. Omar opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. She was completely silenced. His expression of outrage hardened into a mask of impotent defeat. This was a time when she was out of words. Brandon Gill had given more than a punchline, he'd given a knockout. One so nauseatingly petty that even Omar's most die-hard defenders suddenly found their smartphones far more interesting than seeking to justify their fallen star. Gill took a cue from the moment, gradually rising from his seat, buttoning up his jacket methodically, and speaking up again. His tone was definitive, clear, authoritative. It shouldn't be hard to imagine that if Representative Omar can't represent the best interests of American citizens, that maybe Congress should figure out a way to deport her back to Somalia. As Gill sat and settled in his chair, placid and unaffected, a conspicuous air of unspoken understanding crept through the audience. This wasn't just another debate. It was a political murder, live-streamed and burned into memory. Before the gavel had even dropped, the echoes of the chamber reverberated far beyond its marble columns, ricocheting across America's screens and smartphones. Demonstrating its voracious appetite for drama, the media sank its teeth into the blustery exchange, spreading Gill and Omar's incendiary sound bites across TV screens, laptops, and late-night comedy segments. Headlines stretched from the mildly dramatic Capitol clash, Gill versus Omar, to the sensational, "Is Omar's time up? Congressman calls for her deportation." No American coffee shop, office break room, or suburban dinner table was neutral territory anymore. On cable news, talking heads analyzed every syllable and facial gesture, branding Gill either a brave patriot or a political arsonist, depending entirely on the network. Omar's rant, responsibly bleeped, was the signature video of the night, replayed for maximum drama across the networks. It was instant meme bait and no-holds-barred commentary bait, painting her as an equal opportunity victim and villain. Predictably, the public lost its cool. Demonstrations popped up like brush fires around the country, none large enough to threaten buildings, but enough to rattle an otherwise ordinary day. Gill's backers, equipped with patriotic flags and homemade signs reading "Omar must go" and "America first means Americans first," shouted loudly outside courthouses and city halls. Meanwhile, in town squares and college campuses, Omar's supporters furiously waved banners alleging Gill was weaponizing racism, waving colorful posters that read "Gill's hate won't win" and "No human being is illegal." But behind the closed doors of Capitol Hill, Omar's career started to fracture under her. Her committee assignments were promptly curtailed, and calls for an ethics inquiry by other lawmakers poured in faster than leaks from a congressional email scandal. Lobbyists and ex-allies clamored to distance themselves, or feigned what in Washington was used to pass for busy, leaving Omar as politically isolated as anyone can be this far from home, thus watching her influence decompose like a disgraced Hollywood star's good name. A poorly timed tweet did not help. Meanwhile, back in the Texas border town where this storm first started, residents forced a meeting of voices, clearly and unapologetically. Local news crews in search of on-the-ground sound bites encountered no shortage of proud proclamations. "At last somebody who had the courage to say it as it is," said one woman waving a frayed American flag. "We're sick and tired of politicians going soft on criminals and not protecting law-abiding citizens." Back in Washington, Brandon Gill stood again before a bank of microphones and furrowed journalists. Sober and solemn, he eschewed the time spent on pleasantries or political fluff. Each word was deliberate and weighted, his voice ringing clear. "Folks, make no mistake. This country cannot afford leaders who want the unlawful to take precedence over the law-abiding, those flouting our laws over those seeking to obey them. When you want your politicians to put the safety and prosperity of your own people first, that is not racism, and that is not xenophobia. That's just responsible governance." He paused briefly, allowing the full import of his statement to sink in. Our citizens deserve better. And our leaders should be true to their oaths, leaders who know that compassion and lawfulness are not mutually exclusive. They coexist when we put our own communities first. As Gill retreated from the lectern, the country, in unison, grasped one becoming fact: America found itself at a fork in the road, gazing into an ideological chasm as wide and deep as it has ever been. And Brandon Gill had drawn the line, very much in the sand. As the political wreckage from Brandon Gill's storied battle with Ilhan Omar finally settled, America was left to reckon with questions usually considered only during Thanksgiving dinner brawls and awkward high school reunions. Now, people who used to spend their days arguing over which Netflix series to binge were passionately arguing over something a lot more urgent: what exactly are we supposed to require of the people we elect? In living rooms and online comment sections, on airwaves and street corners, everyone had something to say. To some, Gill was the champion they had long needed, finally giving voice to the frustrations of everyday people. Citizens fed up with politicians treating the law like a $5 buffet, selecting what fit their appetite, discarding what didn't. To others, who hews to a though you wouldn't know it from the Times angry secularism, he was a dangerous demagogue, gleefully hitting panic buttons and clutching figurative pearls at the mere idea that yes, perhaps, just possibly, if only a little, even, please, elected officials ought to give more weight to citizens than criminals. While we're on the subject of Ilhan Omar, her recent fall from political grace was the kind of cautionary tale Shakespeare could have scripted, had the bard had access to Twitter and cable news. The Congresswoman had went from media darling to political poison in a matter of hours, realizing that when you confuse activism with accountability, things have a way of catching up to you, often with a subpoena and a cranky ethics committee strong-arming you on the other end. Naturally, TV pundits, blood in the water, were spending marathon hours dissecting every micro-detail of the fatal blow delivered to Gill. For days, the nation was inundated with panels of experts discussing whether Gill's actions were brave or cruel, patriotic or bigoted. Omar's backers didn't even stick around as long as free appetizers at a campaign fundraiser, so that she ended up ranting into microphones held by reporters not so much to document her message as to record her descent into incoherence. In the meantime, Gill's stature grew. He became the embodiment of a movement that was growing, of people who believed America was worthy of politicians who still understood what terms like responsibility and integrity meant, without having to look them up online. Those who had grown weary of watching elected officials barter meaningful governance in exchange for ideological fashion statements while the essential work of securing neighborhoods, guarding borders, and enforcing laws fell to the wayside. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the true message buried beneath all the chaos. Maybe Gill's scathing language wasn't merely an assault, it was a national wake-up call. Because a nation isn't held together by slogans, hashtags, or perfectly timed outrage. It is held together by a mutual respect for rules and shared values, and a willingness to protect what we all profess to hold dear. Not strangers rushing through the back door holding pamphlets handed out by a misguided congresswoman. So as America stopped to catch its breath, a deeper question lingered, one that neither side seemed particularly interested in addressing but that it could not afford to ignore. Whose America is this? Because at the end of the day, regardless of how loudly or passionately one posts, tweets, protests, or pontificates, a country ultimately belongs to anyone willing to care enough to protect its cornerstones. It is owned by citizens who realize that kindness without accountability is not kindness, it's anarchy in nicer clothing. Brandon Gill had drawn his line in the sand. It was now America's turn to meet it. So, dear readers and viewers and fellow citizens, your move. Well, America, the ball is in your court.